Thank you, Noam, and it's a pleasure to be here. As I was reaching in a few minutes ago to make sure that my notes were still intact, I found something even more interesting. For those of you that can't see it, this is my high holiday ticket from 2019, which means that I haven't worn this suit since then. But it's really nice because after 2 years, it's nice to be back and physically be here. I must admit, yesterday when I saw Ellie sort of beamed up on the big board, I was sort of debating, do I want to be on the big board or do I want to be in person? And with hindsight, I decided that being in person was much more intimate and much more meaningful. And of course, couldn't begin without making some comment about the environment in which I find myself. I don't know if I feel more like a bank teller or somebody who worked at a movie theater, but the image that actually comes to mind for those of you that are old enough to remember, and remember in the 1970s growing up on the show called Get Smart, starring Don Adams as Agent 86, and anytime he had something really secret to talk about with the chief, who was played by Edward Platt, they went into the cone of silence, which was this plexiglass apparatus, not dissimilar from this one, that descended upon them as they sat in the office, and that way they thought that nobody could hear them. So I want to start by sharing with you what this sermon is not about. And this sermon is not going to be about any of the exceptional events that characterize our world today. It's not going to be about COVID-19. It's not going to be about vaccines. It's not going to be about the impending election. It's not going to be about Israel or anti-Semitism. It's not going to be about what's happening in Afghanistan. I will leave those topics for orators far greater and far more intelligent than myself. This sermon is about something that I believe is far more important, far more interesting, and far more relevant to our lives. This sermon is about a little boy or girl who walked to the park for the very first time alone. This sermon is about something we have done thousands of times before, hugging our parents. This sermon is about the smell of fresh peaches in the produce aisle of Longo's at Bathurst and Rutherford. This sermon is about what my good friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Zohar Raviv, refers to as finding the exceptional in the mundane. Our lives are often characterized by a series of exceptional events. And in fact, 3 days from now, on September the 11th, we will mark the 20th anniversary of one of those exceptional events that forever changed our world. And today, we don't need to look very far to find these exceptional events that seem to be happening almost daily and sometimes multiple times in a day. And in fact, it was articulated best about how these exceptional events define a person or a lifestyle by Billy Joel in his very eloquent song, 1989, called We Didn't Start the Fire, where he says, and I'm going to try not to sing this, even though the temptation is certainly there. Einstein, James Dean, Brooklyn's got a winning team. Davy Crockett, Peter Pan, Elvis Presley, Disneyland. Bardo, Budapest, Alabama, Khrushchev, Princess Grace, Peyton Place, Trouble in the Suez. We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire. No, we didn't light it, but we tried to fight it. And he goes on in the rest of the song and outlines all of those events that had an impact on who he was and who his generation was. And each of those events, each of those occurrences was exceptional in its own way and had an impact far beyond just Billy Joel, but the entire generation for whom he was speaking. I want to suggest moving away from that exceptionalism lens for the next few minutes and challenge ourselves to find something exceptional in the mundane moments of our lives. Because the mundane moments are far greater in terms of numbers and frequency than the exceptional ones. And these mundane events are what actually dominate our day-to-day life. Instead of focusing on the organs, instead of focusing on the heart and the brain and the lungs, let's focus on the connective tissue, the moments to connect these exceptional events and help provide us with both meaning and, more importantly, context. Take a moment now. Think about something exceptional, something memorable that happened to you in the most mundane routine of your life. And as we do this, I would hope to see a smile and smirk come across your face, but you're all wearing masks, so I can't. But I can only imagine that it's under there. And you're smiling and smirking, and nobody knows what you're smiling and smirking about because this event is exceptional only to you. You were the only one who found exception in what everyone else would see as a very mundane moment. So a few months ago, my 11-year-old son, who's not here because he's not yet vaccinated, hopefully he'll be here next year, went to meet his friends in the park, a friend, for the very first time. And as we stood on the porch and watched him walk down the street and turn the bend to go towards the point, anybody who was watching would have seen this as an extraordinarily mundane moment. Two parents standing on the porch watching their 11-year-old son walk down the street. But it was mundane to everybody, except for us and perhaps even for him. So a few minutes after he left, I'll admit it, I decided to take a short walk. And I happened to pass by the park just to make sure he met his friend without a problem. I approached the park stealthily so as not to be seen. Clearly, I was not as inconspicuous as I might have thought, because within about 30 seconds he saw me. He came running over and said, "Hi, Dad." And I said, "Where's your friend? Are you okay?" And he said, "Well, he was here, but on his way here he lost his hat. It fell off his bicycle. So he went back to look for it." So I said, "Well, why didn't you go with him?" And what he said next, I could not have been prepared for. He said, "I didn't go back with him because if you came looking for me, which clearly you did, and I wasn't in the place I was supposed to be, then you would be very worried. So I decided to stay here in case you came to see me." He was ready to be out on his own, and this seemingly mundane moment was truly exceptional for me. In April, I returned from a month in the States. I was there for work, and upon returning, I quarantined for 2 weeks, as ordered. And at the end of my 2-week quarantine period, having 2 weeks of quarantine under my belt, having been fully vaccinated with both of my Pfizer shots, having had 3 negative PCR tests, I immediately got into my car and drove an hour to our family cottage on Rice Lake to have dinner with my parents. Now, what was different about this? For the past year, we had gotten together outside, wearing masks, socially distanced, but this was the first time that I was able to enter their home, to sit around a dinner table inside, and to give them a hug. Something which, until then, I had taken for granted as being a very mundane activity. You hug your parents multiple times a day when you're younger, and every time you see them when you're older. And to me, the fact that I was able, after 1 year, to hug them was truly exceptional. The truth is, I don't go grocery shopping a lot. I'm not sure if it's because there's a lack of trust, a lack of competence, or maybe I'm just lazy, but I only go to the grocery store in an extreme emergency. A few weeks ago was one of those extreme emergencies. I walked into Longo's with my list, everything that I had to purchase and exactly where to find it. And as I walked by the peaches, which by the way were not on my list, I was overtaken with this scent of peach. It awoke my senses. And so I stood there over this tray of peaches, and like an animated Disney character, I overemphasized leaning forward and took a deep breath and brought the fragrance of the peaches into my nostrils. And for the first time, I was able to taste the peaches through my sense of smell. I was always asked, if anyone said, if you had to give up one sense, what would it be? And for me, it was always smell, right? Smell is not that important, or it's not as important as all the other senses. But I think I changed my mind because I never had that experience before. I never fully realized what an exceptional experience it was to be standing in a grocery store and through my sense of smell taste these beautiful peaches that I was about to buy. Now, I could go on and share with you every mundane moment of my life over the last year or the entire duration of my life. Unfortunately, the only one who would find it exceptional would be me. So in March of 2020, in the New York Times, Simran Sethi wrote a piece called "Why Mundane Moments Truly Matter, How We Spend Our Days is How We Spend Our Lives." And she writes, "My mother and I have sipped tea with Maharanis, swapped stories with Burmese nuns, and bumped through the streets of Bangkok on midnight tuk-tuks. But the delight we return to again and again is the moon. Go outside and take a look," she'll command over text, and I'll stumble out the door to glimpse at the crescent sliver. We swap cell phone photos, fuzzy white discs that are indistinguishable from the ones that preceded them, but often what feels like a newfound delight. Our shared moon, a simple joy that binds us together across years and continents. And she goes on to say, recognizing these moments is important, but also reflecting on these moments helps us to give voice to their meaning. Hundreds and thousands of these moments and the impact they have on who we are as human beings is what truly makes our lives exceptional. I will never forget the moment my son gained his independence and the events that surrounded that. I will never forget when I fully appreciated what a blessing and privilege it was to hug my parents. And I'll never forget how a sensory experience can ignite and awaken all of the senses. I returned from Israel a few weeks ago, and I was blessed to have spent a month there for work. It was my first trip on a plane in 16 months. That was exceptional in and of itself. And I was going to a place and to see people that I longed to be with for almost 2 years. There was nothing truly exceptional about this visit. I didn't attend any exceptional events. I wasn't there during any events that would have caught the headlines that you might have read about. But yet my entire visit was exceptional. And I was unsure how to articulate it to me, let alone to others. And then last week, like so many of you, I received the Habonim bulletin in my mailbox, the hard copy one. I prefer reading hard copy. On the first page, I read about an exceptional event for our community. Thanks to the generosity of the Robbins family, the sanctuary is now adorned with these 8 beautiful stained glass windows, each one representing a Jewish theme that is important to us as congregants and to this community. And as I read through these themes, I was finally able to give voice, finding the exceptional in the mundane of my visit to Israel as it related to each of the stained glass windows. On Friday afternoon, I sat in a cafe on the Tayelet by the beach in Tel Aviv, one of my favorite places on earth. And as I sat there drinking a café hafuch, which is kind of like a cappuccino or a caramel latte somewhere in between, watching the scene around me, I was finally able to apply the following frame. Chaim, life, was all around me. People were laughing and swimming and running and talking, and while I couldn't make out the words of what people were saying, together, their voices sounded like a well-orchestrated symphony. Shalom, peace. It was right before Shabbat, and everybody was walking, religious, non-religious, secular, observant, non-observant, and everybody was wishing each other a Shabbat Shalom, a peaceful Sabbath. Tzedakah, charity. By the lamppost adjacent to where I was sitting, there was a man politely asking people for Shabbat tzedakah. But instead of people hurrying by him or ignoring him or looking past him like he didn't exist, many people stopped and put a few coins or even bills into his cup. Yisrael, Israel. I was there. Enough said. Tzedek, justice. The people I saw were far from a homogeneous group. There were old people and young people, Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, Russian Jews, Ethiopian Jews, and Arab Israelis. And at least for that moment, they all appeared to be the same. They all appeared to be equal. No one group appeared to have any privilege over the next, and there was a sense of justice on that small piece of beach, Tel Aviv. Shirah, song. There was a woman strumming a guitar with worldless memories. And as the sun began to descend and Shabbat became near, I heard in those songs the music of Shalom Aleichem, the Chadodi, and other Shabbat melodies. Torah. On the wall to my right, something that has become infinitely more common in Israel, particularly in Tel Aviv, it was covered in graffiti. But there was one piece that stood out. And as I read it, it said, Im eshkacheach Yerushalayim ze biglal Tel Aviv. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, it's because of Tel Aviv. And there they took a piece of ancient text and juxtaposed it with a piece of modern text and created a debate about Jerusalem versus Tel Aviv, about religious versus secular, about old versus new. And this small phrase demonstrated how Torah and the ancient texts were a part of the air in Israel. Yet there was also a bridge between the ancient and the modern, and that was summed up in the graffiti you see all over the place. And finally is Zachor, remember. Just 100 meters from where I was sitting, there was a memorial to somebody who you may only know as someone who a street was named after, a man by the name of Chaim Elozerov. Chaim Elozerov was a Zionist leader who was murdered on that very same beach almost a century ago as part of the struggle for the creation of the State of Israel. And with the backdrop of the first modern Jewish city getting ready for the Shabbat, I was reminded that we do so on the backs and the memory of those Zionist leaders and those people who fought and gave of themselves so that this state, this modern state, this experience of me sitting on a beach could become a reality. And perhaps ahead of his time, Israel's poet laureate Yehuda Amichai tried to convey the notion of finding the exceptional in the mundane in the second stanza of his poem, Tourists. Once I sat on the steps by a gate at David's Tower. I placed my 2 heavy baskets at my side. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target marker. You see that man with the baskets? Just right of his head. There's an arch from the Roman period, just right of his head. But he's moving, I said to myself. Redemption will only come if their guide tells them. You see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important, but next to it, left and down a bit, there sits a man who's brought fruit and vegetables for his family. The exceptionalism of the mundane activity of a man bringing home food for his family. On that Friday afternoon, as I sat in the cafe by the Tayalet on the beach of Tel Aviv, one of my favorite places on earth, and I sat there drinking my café hafuch, watching the scene around me, my heart was full, and to the casual observer, I was just a guy having a cup of coffee by the beach in Tel Aviv. Nothing exceptional about that. Or was there? I'm not suggesting for a moment that we retreat from the world and those issues that we are passionate about, and we never stop trying to make the world a better place. But I would like to ask you to each day take some time, if you are so inclined. Search for the exceptional moments in the mundane routine of your life, and you will realize how virtually every moment in our lives has the ability not only to be exceptional, but also to be inspirational. As we begin 5782, let's hope that each of us have a year filled with inspiring and exceptional moments that we find, recognize, reflect upon, and cherish in our everyday life. Shana Tova v'Metuka.